Caution. Anglosphere Radio contains psychological warfare. Surrender is advised.
You're telling me Americans feel blessed by diversity?
Yes, they do.
Why is it that they escape from it at every opportunity?
One British politician today talks about British power and British glory. They're ashamed to be British. They're ashamed to be English. They're ashamed to be white. Ashamed of these flags up here and behind me. Well, we're not ashamed.
Why are we allowing out of control degenerate congressmen to decide for us how our nation will look 30 years from now? I don't want to press one for English. I want to press one to have them deported.
Welcome to Anglosphere Radio. I'm TJ.
And I'm Sean. Last time on Anglosphere Radio, we talked primarily about conceptual stuff related to the Anglosphere. Today we're going to be focusing more on current events, and in particular the results of the most recent election, the midterm elections, of course. We're going to be talking about some of the changes to state laws, the referendums that we thought were most important, as well as, of course, about the significance and the quality of the change of the control of the Senate.
Yes, it seems like the Republicans picked up a decent amount in the Senate, with some of them being very good senators in terms of immigration, especially the one from the state you're currently in.
Yes, Mr. Perdue.
Not only is not for granting amnesty, but is for getting rid of birthright citizenship. He's perhaps maybe the best senator in terms of immigration in the Senate.
Definitely one of the better ones, assuming that he ends up voting the way that he responded to surveys about immigration.
Yes, they got a couple of bad ones, though. Isn't there one in Colorado that was pretty bad, I believe?
Yes, the Cory Gardner, the new senator from Colorado, he thinks that part of the final solution to immigration will include the DREAM Act. It supports earned status.
Yes,
but if you ask him, he says he's against amnesty, so I guess that's good.
Yes.
Yes, and also the Steve Daines, the new Republican senator from Montana, essentially won't tell you, from what I can tell, what his stance is on immigration. I went to his website, and he takes a hard, courageous stance against human smuggling and drug trafficking.
Oh, wow, so we basically have two Democrats in terms of immigration that made it on the Republican side. I guess a lot of people on the alternative right, or there's a decent section at least, that are not, of course, supporting the Republican Party. They basically want the U.S. just to burn, and I guess they think somehow it'll be rebuilt more in their image, which I think is wrong for a few reasons. One, first and foremost, is there's not a giant ideology for secession to create a, if you want to call it a European nation, within the U.S. And another is, even if nations do decline, it's usually more of a slow decline than a complete collapse. And I think the U.S. would go more to the, let's say, the current path that France and Portugal are going. They were once great powers, but they slowly just declined into a second, and in Portugal's case, a third to fourth rate power.
Although, of course, there's a significant difference in terms of the diversity that's being introduced. To my knowledge, Portugal isn't filled with non-white people or non-Hispanic people. But yes, whenever, if you want it to happen, that you'll have someday a country within the United States that's just for white people. Then, of course, you need a political party which identifies, or at least a strong subset of a political party that identifies as the white people party. And currently, there isn't a party that does that. But I think it's obvious that the best candidate for that currently is the GOP. Now, maybe in a few decades from now that won't be the case. Maybe in a few decades from now, the Republican Party will, basically have no significance whatsoever due to the demographic decline. But currently, the GOP is the best bet for that.
Yeah, it's just how hard it is to do a third party in the U.S., how the system is built up. on single-member districts as well. If we had proportional representation, it would be easier to support a third party, such as how UKIP was doing very well and got a lot of attention in the European elections. In the United Kingdom, their European Parliament is proportional representation. But you can find,
of course, I mean, we have to live in the Union, probably for all of our lives. I mean, so I'd rather it be less shitty than more shitty. Which
yes,
is presumably what the GOP will lead to, marginally less shitty in the case of some of these senators.
and you do find much more sympathy with our general ideology within the Republican Party for sure. It's just a question of how long and to what extent. Though there is a greater support, I believe, of secession within the general American population, but also I believe in Republican circles as well, in terms of the polling that's been done on it.
Yes, there have been some polls that find that Republicans are more likely to allow secession. I believe is a more inconsistent result, but a very consistent result is that the Republicans are the most likely to actually want to secede.
And race being an important biological and sociological force just isn't currently, at least publicly and conscientiously supported, I'd say, by most people in the U.S., especially people of European descent. And you can't really blame the Republicans for not coming out in support of that, because what are political parties' main goal? It's to win elections. They do some of convincing the public of different positions and such, but their main job is to go with what people currently believe and try to mold that into the coalitions they can build to take power. So you have to first spread the ideology that you want, and the parties, well, at least in part, respond to that. Depending on how big margin you can get.
The Republican Party doesn't have to explicitly come out and say, we're a white nationalist party or something like that, but they can very easily just emphasize those positions which white people identify with, and not emphasize, things like making it easier for people to legally immigrate here, so that they can become a sort of de facto white person party. And to an extent, they already are, but they need to become more of a de facto white person party by essentially emphasizing those things which will help white people identify with the Republicans and help everyone else alienate from the Republican Party. And of course, Republicans, very oddly, I think, are very concerned with capturing the non-white vote.
Yes, that's something we touched on last week. How, actually, if you look at it, I think what was it, like 4 or 5 million people in the Republican base didn't turn out in the past two elections in 2012.
That's correct. And obviously, the Republicans are never going to get 4 million new black voters. There just aren't that many blacks.
Yeah, there isn't as many blacks of voting age that will switch over in that amount. Since there's only, I believe, 45 million black people in the U.S., or 40 million, something like that.
And of course, they talk about Hispanics. There's this crazy myth among conservatives that Hispanics are the natural conservatives. Even though if you look at all the polling data, they're liberal on almost everything, not just immigration.
And they are only, I believe, somewhere around 7% of the voting population, even though they're 14% of the population. So they don't vote nearly as much either as their demographics would suggest that they should. So, I mean, whites are more likely to vote. They're a bigger share of the population, and they're much more likely to vote Republican, which the Republican Party, I believe 90% of their voters are white. And you have the evidence that a large portion of their base stayed home. So especially in the short term, and I would argue even in the long term, they need to appeal to those voters that want to win. And as you said, a great way to do that is to promise to halt immigration, get rid of illegals, do not grant amnesty or provide in-state tuition for illegals or any other welfare programs.
Yes, and the Republican Party also could generally come off as as more ballsy, frankly, I think. From what I gather, a lot of Republicans that are very dissatisfied with the Republican Party are dissatisfied because they feel that in general, they sort of just bend over for Obama. and aren't very consistently strong conservative politicians, even by the sort of mainstream conception of what a conservative is.
Yeah, you see that especially on the talk radio stations like Mark Levin or Michael Savage, Rush Limbaugh, probably Sean Hannity as well.
Yes, they're all very upset with them for those reasons, but to varying degrees. Rush Limbaugh and Hannity are more hacky. The Republican Party.
Yes. Though, too, like you were mentioning, Hispanics are not very likely to be conservatives. I think more than half of their children are currently born out of wedlock. That's not a conservative family value. They're more likely to be on some form of welfare than black Americans. So the most likely demographic to be on a form of welfare. They're going to support a bigger government. And they do. Actually, if you look at the polls, I think it's somewhere around 2/3 of Hispanics support a bigger government with more services and higher taxes versus somewhere around 1/3 support a smaller government with lower taxes and lower services. So, and even on the cultural issues too, besides just having kids out of wedlock, which is and single parenting, which isn't the best move, shall we say. I think more than a majority of them support gay marriage. Do you know of any other cultural issues where
they're relatively anti-gun ownership. They're much less pro-gun than white people are. And I believe that they are also more pro-abortion than white people are.
Yes, that's the other one, the abortion. Though I would say the gun one is much more important. Abortions actually affect blacks and Hispanics more, so.
You know, another ridiculous thing to say about this myth that Hispanics are natural conservatives, you know, Republicans will say that the only reason why they vote Democrat and they act liberal is because they get here and they find out that the Democratic Party is the party for minorities, which is an implicit way of admitting that the Democrat is the non-white party. They'll never say Republicans are therefore the white party. But anyway, the ridiculousness of that can easily be exposed by the fact that if it was true that the American socio-political situation was what caused Hispanics to act liberal, you'd expect Hispanic countries to, by and large, have small conservative governments. And they're all socialists.
A great majority of them are, for sure.
Yeah.
Or lean that way, perhaps.
Either socialists
Populist
or at the very
lefts.
least ridiculously corrupt liberal governments.
Or in the case of Venezuela, both.
Yeah, you would expect that these South American countries and Mexico and Cuba would be paragons of conservatism if Hispanics are natural conservatives.
Yes, what about the propositions in terms of what were passed? I believe the biggest ones were perhaps, I think every ballot where there was one to increase the minimum wage, it passed, which was interesting. I think the lowest one was $8.50 an hour, and the highest was $10 in terms of the state level. I think there were some cities that even passed larger ones. But the marijuana legalization, I know in Florida, surprisingly, the ones that supported legalizing recreational use of marijuana are people that aren't sick but just want to smoke it, is basically what that means, actually passed. But in Florida, they did an amendment where you had to get 60% just for medicinal use or medical use to relieve pain or whatever. But that didn't pass. So the recreational passed, but the one for medicinal use did not pass, which I found quite interesting.
Oh, the difference between allowing medicinal and recreational marijuana use is smaller than one might think. Because a lot of times what will happen is doctors will give people the necessary prescription to obtain marijuana who are basically just stoners that want to use marijuana. I know that a lot of people did that when I lived in California, and it was legal at the state level for medicinal purposes. There were tons of people who would go and get the prescriptions from the doctor. There was nothing wrong with them. They would just go in and say, "Oh, my foot hurts. Well, I feel really bummed because I haven't been able to smoke weed in a week." You know, something just ridiculous. Self-evidently so. But the doctors didn't really care for the most part. And of course it's, I think it's perhaps more problematic than a lot of people appreciate the increased, legalization of marijuana. And I think that the normal political discourse about this is one of the more disappointing ones, because both sides that are most often heard are just completely retarded. On the liberal side, you tend to have some stoner telling you about how marijuana will cure cancer and no one's ever died from using marijuana.
It's natural.
It's natural. It's perfectly non-addictive. And all this sort of retarded stuff. And then on the conservative side, you have some people seem to freak out about marijuana as if the people are taking meth that's also going to turn them into a troll or something like that. And of course you've probably seen all these crazy propaganda videos from decades ago that showed people using marijuana and then going out and doing completely ridiculous stuff. Yeah, I mean, of course, the fact of the matter is, though, that marijuana is associated with some negative neurological effects, especially when you look at those brain areas such as the hippocampus, which have a lot to do with memory. And long-term use of marijuana is associated with memory impairment. It's not addictive in the same way that heroin is, but it is addictive in the same way that almost all pleasurable things are, which is, at the neurological level, primarily a difference of magnitude and not a difference of kind. So they tend to activate the exact same areas of the brain. But also, to me, the most concerning aspects of it are twofold. One, so behaviors normally come in sets, right? When you think of a stoner, you don't just think of some average guy that smokes weed. You think of someone who is also very irresponsible and generally engages in hedonistic behavior. Similarly, when you think about a gay person, you don't think of just an average person who happens to like having sex with people that are male. In reality, you also think about, a flamer. And so one concern is that the increased usage of marijuana and the increased acceptance of the usage of marijuana is going to increase the frequency of other hedonistic behaviors. That's going to encourage a culture that is destructive, even if smoking marijuana itself isn't incredibly destructive relative to, say, drinking alcohol. A lot of people bring up that comparison. But the people that I know that smoke marijuana a good deal have other sorts of behaviors associated with them that are not associated with just people that drink alcohol, which is almost everyone.
Also, perhaps a fear is marijuana use on brain development, especially, I guess a lot of people use it whenever they're in their early teenage years, all the way for, I guess, however long they end up using it. But it's especially damaging at the beginning, at least until they're around 25, which is when the brain mostly fully develops. And there has been studies that have looked into that, and that causes some great problems to the brain, one of which is perhaps the lowering of IQ by a decent margin. I'm trying to remember the exact amount that it was. I think it was at least 2 to maybe 6 IQ points.
And the other concern I would have would be that legalizing marijuana might cause a rise in violent crime. And this is because if you look at the long-term or longitudinal lines showing the frequency of violent crime and the frequency of drug arrests, you notice that about the time that the war on drugs picked up, we started throwing massive numbers of people in jail for drug use. Violent crime also shot down. Now, what that suggests to me is that basically the people, not that everyone that uses drugs, or illegal drugs, not that everyone that uses illegal drugs has a high probability of committing crime, but the people that do have a much higher probability of committing crime than people that don't use drugs, and that therefore throwing those people who are caught with illegal drugs in jail prevents them from committing violent crime out in the public. And then this has a racial aspect, as most things do. Black people have very high rates of violent crime and have very high rates of drug abuse. So when you throw a black guy in jail because he's caught with some drugs, what you may be doing is preventing that same black person from committing a violent crime later on. Now, of course, though, this will not always be the case, and probably the majority of people that are in jail, certainly for marijuana use, would not have committed violent crime. But I think a significant proportion of them would have. Now, on the other hand, there's an ethical issue about whether or not you really want to throw people in jail because they have basically risk factors for being a violent criminal, even though they haven't actually been a violent criminal. And that is somewhat something that probably most people, including myself, are somewhat ethically uncomfortable with. But nonetheless, when people talk about the decriminalization of drugs, they don't often talk about the fact that there is a decent argument that we will see a rise in violent crime as a result of it. It is a real cost, and one that isn't often recognized, I think. Probably because it has these racial overtones to it. And to return to the minimum wage, as TJ was mentioning, Alaska, Arkansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota raised their minimum wage to above that of the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Also, a city in California, I mean, this isn't as significant politically, but it is sort of nutty. A city in California called Eureka raised their minimum wage to $12 an hour. But anyway, neither me nor TJ, I think, have strong views on what the impact of this would be.
It's kind of a question, I guess, is will this, of the jobs that are lost due to the increase in the minimum wage, will it, though, inject overall more money into the economy with more low-wage workers having more income? And, of course, they're going to spend it as a proportion. They're going to spend a larger proportion of their income than richer people would. Will it inject more demand into the economy?
Also, I think that
jobs, or will it just, hurt employment and to a greater degree and retract money from the economy?
Yes, and I think that the research on the relationship between minimum wages and employment, from what I've read, suggests that normally the kind of minimum wage hikes you see in the U.S. do not cause increases in unemployment. Now, that being said, some of these hikes are very large, not the kind you normally see, and therefore it might have more deleterious effects. Interestingly, when I hear about and think about the minimum wage protests that have gone on, I think of states like California and New York. And those are not the places, at least this midterm, that raised their minimum wage. But one thing I did want to say about the minimum wage was that I think that the debate about the minimum wage is a good example of something which is generally true about political discourse, which is that liberals, instead of recognizing that conservatives have a legitimate concern, liberals prefer to pretend that conservatives actually oppose the minimum wage literally because they hate poor people. They want them to make less money, which is obviously not the case. That they oppose the minimum wage because they think that it'll increase unemployment and because it'll hurt business, which will then hurt everyone in the economy. But it fits in, and conservatives don't do this, at least not to nearly the same extent, right? No one says, oh, why do liberals support the minimum wage? Because they hate businesses. No.
They'll only maybe do it, or they used to do on foreign policy concerns.
But the liberals, or the conservatives rather, normally recognize and understand that, the concern for the poor is what drives, say, the liberal position on the minimum wage. And there are studies showing this where you have liberals fill out moral questionnaires about your moral beliefs as if they were the typical conservative. Conservatives do it as if they were the typical liberal. And what you find is that conservatives have a relatively accurate view of the morals of liberals, whereas liberals have an abysmally inaccurate view of the morals of conservatives, where they essentially think that they don't have them in some important respects. So the minimum wage, I think, policy-wise, is an ambiguous, sticky, empirical question, but there is something interesting about the discourse that is normally had about it. It relates to politics generally.
Another interesting aspect, I'd say, as well, of the election is it seems Obama still is saying that he's going to not wait much longer to take action on immigration. So one has to wonder if he's actually going to do an executive order that will legalize, in a great large part, most of the illegals in this country. And just go around Congress completely. And what the Republicans will do about that, especially within the next 2 months or so, while the Democrats still control the Senate, before the Republicans take a further majority in the House and a majority in the Senate.
And the Republicans, John Boehner and company, have assured the president that they're not going to try for impeachment or anything, which I think was a horrible mistake. You should never take that off the table. Of course, impeachment is an extreme thing to do, but at this point they're assuring him that that's not even a threat. Which is unfortunate because, of course, if he decides to go the more dictatorial route, then, and if they have control of the Senate, I don't think that it would be necessarily a bad thing to try to impeach him. Now you can say they don't have enough of a majority in the Senate to actually get it done, and that may or may not be true. But on the other hand, the impeachment process for Bill Clinton arguably both hurt Bill Clinton's reputation and therefore the Democrats' reputation dramatically, because there were some legitimate concerns involved, and it inhibited Bill Clinton from doing anything for a very long time. And, from the Republican perspective, hurting the Democratic brand name, and stopping Obama from doing anything. Well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. And, I mean, it's legitimate, I think. I think that already Obama has done so many, ridiculous executive orders that are obviously violating not only the Constitution but also just the recent precedent set by presidents. It would be legitimate to impeach him.
Yeah. So overall, it was a good night for the Republicans. They even took governorships in Wisconsin, or they kept the governorship in Wisconsin, should I say, which voted for Obama both times. Perhaps the most surprising governorship race was in Illinois, where Pat Quinn lost to the Republican challenger, Obama's political home state. They even gained, I guess, the governorship of Maryland, which was somewhat surprising, and they retained the governorship in Florida. But overall, yeah, it was a good night for Republicans, and we'll see how it turns out.
Well, it was a good night, at least in the very short term, although I'm not convinced that the GOP taking the Senate was actually a good thing for them. Now, in the first place, this is because, as we sort of talked about before, we looked at the policy positions on immigration of all of the new Republican senators, and the majority of them had crappy positions. And by crappy position, I basically mean that they didn't even meet the bottom threshold of clearly taking a strong position against amnesty. But also because the Republicans with this control of the Senate, they can't pass anything. Sure, Harry Reid's not going to be the one blocking every bill. Obama is now. But Obama still is. They don't have enough to overrule him, enough seats in the Senate. And they're going to be blamed, therefore, in the stagnating government, which they already were, amazingly. Even when the Democrats controlled the Senate and the White House, it was the Republicans involved in the House that Harry Reid was sitting on bills. But regardless, they're going to be blamed even more, I fear, for the stagnating government. And people always hate Congress. No one likes Congress, and the GOP is now Congress. They control both houses of Congress. And I fear that that's going to hurt them in 2016.
Yeah, the Congress is more unpopular than the presidency is currently. So,
yes, in 2016, that could make them less likely to take the White House.
And they're less likely, yes, to be able to make the case they're outsiders, since they only controlled one area of the Congress, the House of Representatives, where they form the spending bills, which is important. But now, since they'll control both, there'll be a competing branch with the presidency. It's interesting, too, that they won. I really didn't see a consistent, at least national message from the Republican Party.
I think the message was just not Obama.
Yes.
Like here when Purdue, I'm in Georgia, and Purdue running against Nunn, the ad that I heard most often was just this line that Michelle Nunn is going to be a rubber stamp for President Obama, that she's going to vote with him 99% of the time. I didn't hear. Purdue takes great positions on immigration. He wants to end birthright citizenship. But I didn't hear about that in Georgia until after until we looked up the positions of everyone on immigration. Rather, instead of hearing much of anything about Purdue, what I heard about was Michelle Nunn is going to be a rubber stamp for Obama. So that at least in Georgia, and from what I've heard around the nation, it seems to be the case that the message primarily was just, we're gonna stop Obama and the socialist takeover.
Oh, they talked about more local state issues, perhaps as well. But yes. Well, I think that does it for our show today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to Anglosphere Radio. We will be joining you again next week. Good night.